Good morning. Today is Thursday, October 16th. We are now in the second week of a fall semester of our Gemara Shiur, where we are exploring Talmud on the boundary of life and death. So our study includes practices, rituals, philosophy, belief around death and dying, around what awaits us after we die. But as Rabbi Platcow and I were kind of reviewing our texts for the course, both today's lesson and the forthcoming lessons, where we want to do some deep dives into the mysteries of Talmud on this subject, we arrived at the shared conclusion that so much of the Jewish tradition's texts and teachings around death and dying come primarily to illuminate not what awaits us after, but how we live before. How we live before we die seems to be the overriding thrust of Jewish wisdom on the subject of death, dying, and what awaits us after we die. Even the texts that talk about the hereafter, variously described with different terminologies in Jewish tradition, and some of you have studied this material with me previously. Even those texts seem to illuminate the overriding Jewish concern with what constitutes a life well lived. This life, the embodied life, the life we get when we are born into this world up until the time that we die and are taken from this world. That is not to say that Judaism does not touch on what happens after we die. We're going to get there. And in fact, we were asked a pointed question last week about traditions concerning resurrection, bodily resurrection within the Jewish tradition. And I said, yeah, believe it or not, that's actually in there too. It's like that old commercial for, was it ragu sauce, where the tagline was, "It's in there." I don't know, but what's in there? Like peppers and real food. That was the thrust. It's in there. So when people say, resurrection in Judaism, yeah, it's in there. We'll get there, but not today. Uh, Last week we looked at a two different texts. We looked at Mishnah and Talmud on Yoma, which is the long form excursus on the Day of Atonement on Yom Kippur, which illuminated the infinite value of a single life. This is, of course, a theme that I'm sure is familiar to you, even if you can't cite chapter and verse. It is mentioned in 1,000 different ways in our sacred literature that a single life is infinitely precious. The the means by which we arrived at that same shared conclusion last week was around Sabbath restrictions and how if a body is buried under a pile of rubble or rocks that has fallen and it is the Sabbath, one is nevertheless not only permitted but commanded to clear away the debris in order to save life. Whether the person we know to be living or dead, if there is even a modicum of doubt that the person might still be alive, we save life. Whether the person is Jewish or Gentile, which may, the fact that they're even asking that question may cause us to raise an eyebrow. Nevertheless, the Talmud wants to make clear that you don't hesitate for a second if there is even an iota of doubt that a person who has been injured on the Sabbath might have a fighting shot at being alive. And the passage we did not get to read, the elaboration in Gemara, in the Talmud on Yoma, page 85a, and then on to page B, explicates this further by defining and describing what we really mean by death. And so it talks about, well, is the person breathing? Do they have a pulse? And there's other, I would call it, medical stuff, though we should never confuse our sacred literature for a medical or scientific textbook. They did the best they could with what they had at the time. And I think there's a lot of proof in our sacred literature, the Talmud especially, that Judaism has always been willing to integrate findings from science and specifically biomedical science into its ethical outlook, what it means to live a righteous life. We incorporate science, we don't shun it. And that's one of the themes that I sounded in my remarks on Kol Nidre. That was where we began last week. The preponderance of our time was spent looking at a famous passage concerning what we would euphemistically call a case of euthanasia, a person who is suffering as he is dying, getting ready to leave this world. And over the protestation of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's devoted disciples, who are literally in the passage keeping him alive with their incessant prayers, his empathetic maidservant goes up onto the rooftop and disrupts their praying in order that he might die more quickly. And that opened up a whole long conversation because many of us have actually been in this tenuous position with a loved one where we know that a loved one is not long for the world. We know that he or she is suffering. We know that it is not Jewish, it is not ethical in our tradition to promote death actively. But the real question is, because there's a dilemma, and I always teach when I teach ethics, a dilemma, an ethical dilemma, is not actually a choice between right and wrong. What makes an ethical a dilemma is that it's a choice between right and right. You have two competing positive values. In the case of the text we examined under Rabbi Platcow's steady guidance last week, we're really contemplating the dilemma of Judaism does not promote death. Judaism always promotes the saving of life, or almost always. There is an asterisk around there that we'll keep returning to throughout our course of study. There are a few, very few, noteworthy exceptions to when pikuach nefesh, the saving of life, is paramount or is not paramount. But shorthand, for all intents and purposes, Judaism promotes pikuach nefesh, always save a life when given the opportunity. That's one ethic. That's one value, positive value of Judaism. Another, however, is the mitigation of suffering, right? Judaism believes that we did not come into this world for the purpose of experiencing pain and suffering, and to the extent that we can alleviate our own and others' pain and suffering, that too is a Jewish value. But what do you do when the two are in direct conflict with each other? And that was the case we looked at last week. What do we do where we know that we're not supposed to, we can't just kill the guy, but he's suffering and he's not going to live long. So how do we balance those two? And it's clear from the text, which is, again, not framed in halachic language. The passage we looked at last week was Agadah, or lore, folkloric. It was storytelling. It was teaching by way of anecdote. Nevertheless, it elucidates a key Jewish principle, or the dilemma of two key Jewish principles, the delicate interplay between saving a life on the one hand and mitigating suffering on the other. Now, normally those two are not in conflict with each other. Normally you can go about your time on this earth doing both, fulfilling the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh and of alleviating suffering. But on the boundary of life and death, as we saw with the story of Yehuda Hanassi and his maidservant last week, they do come into conflict, and then it's a dilemma. And it's interesting that the Talmud implicitly praises the maidservant for her action. She's certainly not condemned for it, for create or facilitating a good death, an easy death. And good death, transcribing from the Greek roots that mean good death, we arrive at the word euthanasia, just as a little fun linguistic addendum to our study from last week. So that's kind of a recap of where we were a week ago. Today we've selected a few wonderful texts for us to explore, and we have kind of a lineup of other texts that we're going to get to in the course of our weekly study. So today we're going to explore the question of what is a life worth? Is one person's life worth more than another's? How and the way I frame this actually comes to me from my chavruta, my rabbinic study partner and teacher, Rabbi Jan Katsu, who I know is also a teacher and mentor to Rabbi Platcow, having taught at Hebrew Union College for many years and having retired a little over a year ago. Maybe it's 2 years now. And of course, a dear friend to WRT, just as a fun save the date, please mark Sunday, November 2nd at I think noon or 12:30, say noon in the CJL. We're kicking off a month of studying the last 30 years of Israeli history and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a subject to which I am returning after 2 years. Did a course on this after October 7th, coming back to it in a more narrow lens of just the last 30 years. Kicking off our study with a retrospective that begins with the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha, whose murder was 30 years ago next month. Rabbi Katsu is going to begin that study with me as a tag team teaching in person at WRT. We will stream the class and we will record and upload the class, but it will not be interactive with the online participants. It'll be interactive with the in-person participants. So it's just kind of a static live stream. Rabbi Katsu said, or framed our subject for today's inquiry as follows. How does Judaism view the difference between net worth and ultimate worth? So at the end of the day, what do we take with us and what does it all mean? That's where we're going to direct our thoughts today. Rabbi Platcow, do you want to bring on screen our first text and take it away?
Yes, I'd love to. What a fabulous introduction, also. I especially love the preponderance of our time. And today we're really going to get into this understanding of what is wealth in our life now, and does it continue on with us, and should it or should it not? So as I am sharing my screen, we'll dive in. All right, here we are. So we have a number of different pieces of halacha, of Jewish law here, that is put forth by our Talmud, and here we'll see that there is actually often when we have Jewish law put forth, especially in the Talmud, we don't really get a lot of reasoning for why we do things in this specific way. Here we get a couple lines here and there. So it starts, this is the beginning of the Gemara coming off of the Mishnah, Tanu Rabbanan, and the rabbis taught, and we can tell by some of the wording here that this is from a Braita. This is from a piece of text that was written around the time of the Mishnah, but didn't quite make it in. So we're going to see a number of Braitot here. And it starts, Barishona hayu molichin bevet ha'evel. Okay, so at first, Barishona, right? Rishon, the first day of the week, Yom Rishon. At first, when food would be brought to the house of the mourning, or the mourner, Ashirim, and we begin to see the duality here that we're going to see time and time again. Ashirim, for those who were wealthy, Biklatot shel kesef v'zahav. Okay, so it was brought in baskets of silver and gold. And klatot is really a special word. That's the same word as is used for when the first fruits were brought to the temple for sacrifice. So there's some kind of majesty going on here. There's certainly beauty, right? Kesef shel zahav, silver and gold. And there's really there's almost a formality here, and a beauty in that formality. Va'aniyim, and for the poor, B'salei nitzarim shel arava, and we know the word arava because we just celebrated Sukkot. Arava means willow, klupa or klufa. And when we say these words, nitzarim is as cheap wicker as you can get. It's as if someone has gathered all of the willow branches that have fallen by the weeping willow, their dead branches, and they've put them all together into a basket. Certainly, it takes some kind of handiwork, but this is not something that is brought to the temple in a way of beauty or formality or majesty. This is something that was kind of put together by the side of a river by someone who is in fact ani, who is in fact poor, and just so that we're getting ani versus ani here, it's not exactly easy to see. Or easy to hear rather, but ani you'll see right here. I'm highlighting it in with my arrow. You have the ayin nun yud as opposed to the ani, which means I or me, which is spelled with an aleph nun yud. Anyway, so we have this setup of the wealthy versus the poor. V'hayu aniyim mitbaishim. And the aniyim would become embarrassed. And we know that embarrassment is something that our sages then and still today hold to be a real offense. If you're embarrassing someone, it is said that it is as if you killed a piece of them. So embarrassment is really taken seriously, and we can see that it's taken seriously by the next line. Hikinu sheyehu hakol mivi'in besaleh nitzarim shel arava klufa. So from that moment on, the sages instituted that every single meal would actually be brought in the wicker willow baskets. Mipne, and the reasoning here, which is nice for us to receive, kvodan shel aniyim. And we know this word kavod, and maybe we'll take a little bit more of a deep dive into that word in a few minutes. Kavod means respect or honor or dignity. And I'll ask when we get to the end of this specific duality between wealth and poor, or wealth and poverty, we'll unpack that word kavod. Which English definition should we really use? Should we use respect? Should we use dignity? Should we actually have all three of those words kind of bundled up into one?
Mara asked a question that allows me to elucidate a little technical point. So, Rabbi, would you just leave that passage up there? She
Sure.
asked in the chat window, does the text, quote unquote, instruct people to bring a meal in gold and silver baskets, or is it just a custom that arose? And I think we learned from this text that that was the prevailing custom. And by the way, custom is not something to be, scoffed at or cast aside in Jewish tradition. As my teacher at HUC, Rabbi Dr. Mark Wachowski, my Talmud professor, always would teach us, one generation's minhag or custom is the next generation's halacha or law. In other words, a lot of what we do as Jews begins as just the custom of the people. And it takes on the force of law by being widely adopted. But in this case, a custom is directly overridden by what is called a takana. A takana is a really important word in rabbinic law. It's when the rabbis actually write and issue an edict. It comes from the root litakein, as in tikkun olam, to fix or repair. So it's a decree, but it carries the force of repairing something that the rabbis deem to be unfit or broken. And so you can see that the word that is used here is hitkinu, shiyu hakol mivi'in besalei nitzarim. So in other words, they issued a takana, they instituted is the word that the translator gives us here, but literally they fixed something that they thought was wrong. And clearly, we can identify the thing they felt was wrong was that a dichotomy had arisen between how the rich and how the poor were being treated specifically in death. And we have a similar custom in Scarsdale. It's called standing room only. It's the caterer that literally every Shiva house I go to is catered by standing room only. Jack is doing a fine, brisk business there because that's one need that never goes out of business. But anyway, it's clear that there was a custom, it was a prevailing custom, but the rabbis actually got involved and did a takana. They hitkinu. They fixed something that they felt was not correct.
Beautiful. Thank you. So then we continue on and we see the dichotomy again. Tanu Rabbanan, Barishona Hayu Mashkin Beveta Evel. Okay, so in the beginning, and this is also about Beveta Evel, in the house of the mourner, they would drink. And the gloss here, courtesy of Adin Steinsaltz, it says that they would serve wine, but mashkin literally means to drink. So they would drink something. Maybe it was wine. Ashirim, and now we have these nice little em dashes which show us a little bit more of the grammar of the text and the way we should read it. Ashirim, for the wealthy, bizchuchit levana. Bizchuchit, zichuchit is a little wine cup, or a little glass, and levana, a white glass. So for the house of the wealthy, they would drink it out of a white glass. Va'aniyim bizchuchit tzevua. In the house of a poor person, they would drink it out of a colored glass. And it's really interesting because I looked up some of the history here. In Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, colored glasses were actually seen as the luxury, and the raw materials for early glass were full of impurities. So the natural glass was often tinted or opaque, and ancient glassmakers would use cobalt or other kind of prized blues and sometimes lead for yellow to show a certain status. However, during the Roman era, this proposition was really flipped on its head, and clear glass or white glass became a status symbol for wealth. And Roman glassmakers developed techniques to, quote, decolor glass, intentionally removing the natural iron oxide tint. This clear, transparent glass was a luxury item because it demonstrated the maker's skill and the high purity of the materials. According to some historians, elite Romans favored clear glass decanters and cups to showcase the color of the wine. So actually, our ashirim here and the prevailing culture around them, which was at the time Roman culture, were perhaps our first wine snobs. So if you are into wine, perhaps you can date yourself back all the way to this time period. Okay, so enough of the history. Hayu haniyim mitbaishin. So the exact same thing. The poorer people were embarrassed by this. So hitkinu, we have again a takana. She yehu hakol mashkin bizchuchit tzevua. So everyone was going to now drink from glasses that were colored, just like the wealthy of the Mesopotamian and ancient Egypt cultures. Mipnei kavodan shel aniyim. So that there could be some kind of preserved dignity, preserved honor, preserved respect to the poor. So it continues. Barishona hayu migalin penei ashirin chasin penei aniyim. Okay, so now it's a slightly different situation. We're no longer in the house of the mourner. Instead, we're talking about when a poor person versus a wealthy person dies. And when a poor person dies, their face is covered with a sheet. And when a wealthy person dies, at this point at least, Barishona in the beginning, at first, they were not covered with a sheet. And our Talmud gives us a reason, and perhaps the doctors among us might be able to shine a little bit of light on this as well. Mipnei shehayu mushcharin penehen mipnei batsoret v'hayu aniyim mitbayishin. Okay, so the reason given is that because the poor were starving or really suffered from hunger on a regular basis, their faces would turn black after, and we can see that word in mushcharin. The word for black is shachor right here. So their faces would turn black, says our Talmud, and thus we would cover them at the time. This actually, I did some research, and this actually is kind of a myth. And discoloration after death sets in regardless of whether or not you've been eating. Perhaps it sets in slightly faster if you haven't been eating, and this term is called livor mortis, which it means blood pooling, and it starts happening very soon after a person dies, because the blood settles in the face and causes a purplish discoloration. Later, decomposition causes skin to turn black for everyone. And often happens if someone's skin is slightly lighter, it's a little bit more visible, but it happens to every single person. And v'hayu aniyim mitbaishin. So the poor were embarrassed once again by this difference in treatment. So the rabbis step in again, hitkinu. Sheyehu mechasin pnei hakol. So they would cover the faces of everyone, mipnei kvodan shel aniyim, in order to preserve the dignity or the honor of the poor. We continue. There's another opportunity for us to see this exact same story, this exact same format. Barishona hayu motziin ashirim bedargesh. For the wealthy. In the beginning, when they would be brought out from the funeral home or from their home, depending on the location, they would be brought out on a dargesh. And a dargesh is a beautiful couch. I wasn't able to find any pictures, but you will see that now a dargash or a dargesh is actually a style of hospital bed, and it looks like, it's obviously on wheels. It was the same back in that time, but it's very comfortable. It has all kinds of padding. This person looks very happy in their dargesh right here. However, the aniyim bichlicha. For the poor, they would be brought out on the pronunciation of this word always eludes me. Some people pronounce it be'er, some people pronounce it bear. In any case, this is what it looks like, and it is not nearly as comfortable. There aren't any pillows. This is a much more modern version, but it doesn't really have the wheels. It was really much more something like this that a person who was ani, a person who was poor, was brought out on. And once again, we see v'hayu aniyim mitbaishin, and perhaps we're seeing that there is now a crowd gathered around for the funeral procession, and all of the people of the town are seeing your loved one brought out on either this thing that is, again, just like the difference between the klatot, the basket of silver and gold that is that is carrying the first fruits to the temple, and the saleh, the basket that is really made out of the poorest wicker one can find. We're seeing again in front of the entire town as your loved one is brought out to be buried, there is really a difference in beautification and also in almost kavod, right? If we envision a person of royalty being brought out in front of their in front of the people that they rule over, that person would not be brought out in something like this. They would be brought out in something regal with cushions that showed a bit of beauty, that showed a bit of care. So it's not surprising that our poor people, our aniyim, are feeling embarrassed. Hitkinu, the rabbis step in again. Sheyehu hakol motziin bichlicha. All of the people now going forward will be brought out on this bear. Mipnei kvodan shel aniyim. Because this is a way to preserve the poor, the honor, the respect for the aniyim. So let's have a quick conversation about this word kavod, and of course we'll also take any other comments. But I want to bring up the Jastrow definition of kavod here. We have the first definition, which is importance, but I want to focus on this second definition.
Jastrow, by the way, Jastrow is a legendary Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon or dictionary that is also well known as a torture device for rabbinical students.
Yes. I was just going to say, I'm sure that Rabbi Blake can feel some nostalgia and maybe a little bit, maybe a little poke of pain.
Yeah, you say the word
back to the
Jastrow, and all of a sudden I'm discomfited.
Yes, exactly.
Spent a lot of time poring over my Jastrow back in the day.
I believe it. So we have, and thank God it's online now. It's so much easier to use. So we have these three words: honor, respect, dignity. Each of them kind of connote a slightly different thing. Honor is something, you give to a person who is often of higher authority. Respect, we hear over and over and over again, everyone deserves respect. And dignity is a word that is often used around bereavement specifically. So I'm interested in what comes up for people when they hear those three words, and also if there are any reactions to the text thus far. Yeah, go ahead, Judy, please.
This now is something that explains why it has been said a Jewish burial should be in a plain wooden box. You don't go for a gorgeous coffin, and that's, again, it equalizes the end of life and the respect we give to each other, and the cost of something that could be very, very costly, but that's not what we want.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
This is in fact exactly parallel to the modern Jewish custom of the plain pine box, which, by the way, was exactly the vessel for carrying the remains, the body of Prime Minister Rabin. I actually was able to process in an immense funeral procession to pay my respects to the fallen prime minister back in November of '95, just a day after his assassination. They had his body lying in state on the outdoor plaza of the Knesset. And it was indeed plain pine box draped in a black cover with a white Jewish star on it. Though interestingly, many of us do not know this, but in Israel, typically bodies are buried without a casket. They are in shrouds. They are in the tachrichim, the traditional burial shrouds, and they go straight into the ground. In America, there are actually laws that prohibit funeral homes from preparing bodies for burial without a casket. So in almost every, right, is that right, Rabbi? You're the burial and death expert here.
Yeah, you paused. You came out of Wi-Fi for just a moment there, at least for me. I don't know if it was for anyone else. But but yes, you're totally right. There are laws in now not all of the United States anymore that you can't be buried directly into the ground or in some kind of shroud. You have to have a box of some kind around you. But Vermont just passed a law last year for compostable burying, also known as green burying, in which a person is placed directly into the ground, sometimes with just a sheet over them, and sometimes with absolutely nothing. And this is really something that has been taken up as our planet has continued to see heat rises and things like that. By some environmental activists. I think also, there's something special to be said for the fact that when you have less around you, your body is able to go back to the earth quicker, and that's actually one of the reasons why the plain pine box is such a tenet of Judaism as well. Doug and Marge.
I have to give my props to Russell, who put a comment in the comments section that was exactly what I was going to say. But I'm looking at all of this as kind of the subtext, which is the avoidance of anything that might be construed as Egyptian death practices.
Yes, that is very interesting. In the class that I taught last year, maybe we'll go into it a little bit this year. We talked about sarcophagi, which, as we know, was really an Egyptian and ancient Mesopotamian practice. And it turns out that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who we spoke about last week, was perhaps or allegedly buried in a sarcophagus rather than in a coffin or in the ground. So it's interesting how much we cling to the practices of those around us as Jews, and versus how much we distinguish ourselves in our own practices and make some kind of separation between ourselves and those around us.
It is pretty clear that there are efforts undertaken in the Jewish tradition not to preserve bodies the way the Egyptians did, which it's all the more striking when you read the final passages of the book of Genesis and you learn what happened to Joseph, because Joseph actually was turned into a mummy in accordance with the practice of the place where he had lived most of his life, in Egypt. And again, as Rabbi Platcow mentioned, that in the rabbinic period, it was actually really common for people to be buried in stone sarcophagi, and for those to be entombed in a mausoleum, which is basically just an above ground burial cave. And you can visit these places. They're all over ancient Israel and the ancient Near East. There are lots and lots and lots of stone sarcophagi containing the bones of Jews from the rabbinic period, the Mishnaic period, like the first few centuries of the Common Era. Again, think about the civilizations with which Jews were interacting at the time. Very common in Greek and Roman practice. And so as Jews became better integrated into the secular or the non-Jewish society, it should not surprise us that certain customs, again, a lot of this is governed by custom more than law, will prevail among the Jewish community. And if you're a little bit perplexed by this and say, well, wait a minute, really? We have above ground burial for Jews? We do, as a matter of fact, and the authorization is given by none other than Abraham and the entire line of Abraham, because Abraham and Sarah and their progeny are buried in a cave, the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, in Kiryat Arba, which is just south of Jerusalem. It's presently in the West Bank. It's a pretty interesting place. It's not an easy place these days. There's a huge conflict between the majority Palestinian population and the Haredi Jewish population, and most of the tensions flash around that one holy site, the Cave of the Patriarchs. But yeah, above ground burial is a thing, and I can't tell you, I've done a ton of above ground that we don't call it interment, it's called entombment. So lots of Jews are in mausoleums, even in Jewish cemeteries. Westchester Hills Cemetery in Hastings, you can visit the mausoleums of George and Ira Gershwin just as you
Exactly what I was going to
pull
say.
in through the main gate. George and Ira are entombed in a mausoleum, and that too is within the broad spectrum of Jewish burial practice.
Yeah, and you can actually, when you are in Israel next, you can go to Beit She'arim, which is the alleged resting place of Yehuda HaNasi. And there's a little bit of head scratching that goes on here, especially around the word assimilation, which is a word that the seventh graders learned in the Israel curriculum with me yesterday. And the question of when it comes to Joseph, when it comes to Abraham, when it comes to Yehuda HaNasi and more, and George and Ira Gershwin, is this assimilation, or is this actually seen as the proper burial? And if it is seen as the proper burial, how does that actually play into our concept that we're dealing with today, the Ashirim versus the Aniyim? Because certainly for Yehuda HaNasi, and this is even written in some of the commentary on the Mishnah, for him, this was seen as a way to not only ingratiate the Jewish people as he was an ambassador to the Roman Empire, but to ingratiate the Jewish people to the Roman Empire, and also to say, this is actually what we do. This is how we hold up a person of honor, talk about honor and dignity at death. And now we turn to our very own Joseph.
Hi, I want to refer back to your original question about those three words. You mentioned honor and dignity. What was the third word?
The third word is respect.
Respect.
Here, you
Now,
can see it right here in
I
the
think
side of the page. It's a
I
little
think
small.
in the respect, honor, and okay, those three words I think were considered by the sages who made the wise decision to make the burials more equal rather than have the rich and the poor. So I think that was the start of somebody saying, to the effect where now you could say, there's a very expensive present that you can buy somebody, or there's a minimal and you should be thankful for both. So I think when you're burying, whether it's a rich or a poor person, I don't think rich or poor has anything to do with honor, respect, and dignity. I think everybody, and I think that's what was their mission, to give the opportunity for everybody to have respect, honor, and dignity for having lived. Just had a quick thought of when you go to what do you call it? Burial, a funeral. When you go to a funeral, my parents taught me, you go to a funeral to respect not the family, to show them that you're there, but you go to respect the dead person for the life that he lived. And I think that's, I'll stop now because I have another question to ask about the more expensive coffins versus the inexpensive coffins. You're not respecting anybody more. Certainly not respecting the dead person by buying a more expensive coffin.
Yeah, beautiful. And I'm really happy that you brought up the conversation of who are we respecting or showing dignity or honor to. And there's a whole conversation by one of the Talmudic commentators, the Rif, who talks about, are we trying to show this kavod to the person who has died, to this deceased person, or are we trying to show the kavod to the bereaved family? And it's an interesting conversation because we say, and And it is, in fact, true that almost all of the rituals around death and mourning are done for the mourner. They're not done in a show of support as much for the deceased. Of course, there is a layer of that, whether or not we perform these rituals. But for instance, if you sit days of Shiva, it is about the mourners sitting the Shiva. When we rip Kriya, also that is about the mourner. Each of these rituals are about the mourner. One of the only rituals that is done specifically to give dignity or respect or honor, kavod, to the deceased person is tahara, the ritual and hygienic cleansing of the body before burial. Go ahead, Russell. And then we'll move on to the last piece.
I hope this question isn't jumping the gun, but when every time you give us text to read, I'm always interested in what it doesn't say. And one of the things it doesn't say here is that it operates on the assumption that there is going to be a ritual. Not having a ritual is not an option. Forgoing the burial is not an option. It's all talking about equalizing it. And so to me, the what's interesting here is not, the dichotomy, making the rich and the poor of equal valence, but what this is saying about the role of ritual in our deaths, which of course casts a light on what is the role of ritual in our lives. And I wonder if, as I say, am I jumping the gun? Is that where the rabbis are going with this?
So this is a perfect segue. I'm going to skip two small pieces of our sugya here, of our chunk of text. These pieces deal with being embarrassed while sick, or embarrassed in the way that a person dies, and I'm happy to go back and go through them. But the real end to the sugya and the meat is this last piece right here, and it reads in the same way: Barishona haita hotzaat hamet kasha likrovav yoter mi tato. So at first, as all of these pieces have begun, in the beginning, taking out the dead in order for burial was harder for the loved ones of that person than the actual death itself. Okay. And the rabbis say why, and if you read in the gloss, which is not in the actual text, you can see a little bit of why. It says because it was customary to bury the dead in expensive shrouds, which the poor could not afford. But ad shehayu, it was so much harder that those loved ones, Karovav, manichin oto uvorchin, would leave that person, that deceased person, and run away from them. And vorchin is really like that's like a fleeing the scene kind of word. So this is really setting up an issue of not just equality, but whether or not, as you said, Russell, the ritual that we thought was assumed, a given, is even happening at all. And this is actually still a reality today in some cases, where some people who live in poverty or whose families are not wealthy enough to provide a proper burial for them are left in funeral homes for sometimes weeks, sometimes months, until there can be enough funds raised either by the family or by the funeral home themselves as a way of tzedakah, or in some cases there are disputes about how a person should be buried, and families leave their loved ones in funeral homes just there for days and weeks and months. And if anything, is not kavod, that certainly falls under that category. So we continue, and this was an issue until Ad Sheba Rabban Gamliel, and this is a new character, Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's successor. So he took the role right after Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi as this Nasi, as this representative of the Israelites, of the Jews, to the Roman Empire. So this guy, where we have Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and I'm glad that this came up, was buried in a sarcophagus in accordance to what was a sign of honor and beauty and regalness in the Roman Empire. We have a very, very different way of burial here. Ad Sheba Rabban Gamliel, until Rabban Gamliel came along, v'nahag kalot. And the word kalot here, or kalut, excuse me, is actually a halachic term. We have machmir, meaning stringent, meaning bearing ourselves into the law and going and seeing it, and nahag, really leading and being a part of it in the most stringent way, and kalut, which is an easier way, or a leniency in the law. So he behaved in a lenient way, rosh be'atzmo, ve'yatsa bichlei pishtan. So instead of being buried in this way of regalness, he was buried in pishtan. And the text says, the translation says, he came and acted with frivolity, and when he was buried in Pishtan, and then we have it down here, linen garments. When he was taken out for burial, he was buried in as simple as it gets. And Rav Papa, Amar Rav Papa, this is another character, a much later character. He comes in and he says, now we get the Aramaic, Veha idina nahug alma afilu betsar da bar zuza. This piece of burial is not even worth one zuz, or 1 dinar, I think the text says here, 1 zuz. And we remember the word zuzah, or the word zuz, from Chad Gadya, right? That my father bought with 2 zuzim, this one little goat. So what Rav Papa is saying is that from then on, from Rabban Gamliel's action here on, to not only set some kind of great equalizer that death does indeed set for us, but in order to make it so this ritual was available to all who wanted it, some sense of inclusion there. From then on, the shrouds that people were buried in were not worth more than 1 zuz. And I just want to show, I'm going to share a different screen of mine. I just want to show what the tachrichim, what the linen garments are today. Here we go. So this is what people are buried in today. And we heard the word tachrichim, that's what they're called, the linen garments. In our text, obviously, there are a few different words. One of them, they're really just the words for the fabrics, the linen. But this is what they look like today. I see we have a few hands. Dad, go ahead.
Thanks, Rabbi. So with respect to the topic of cost, I remember really very clearly when your grandfather, my father, passed away, and I was meeting with the funeral director, and he was, running down the litany of costs associated with the funeral. At the end, he summed it up and he said, I just want you to know, if there's any aspect of this that you want, that you find is overpriced or that you can't afford, I want you to know that we will take care of that for you, and you should not even think twice about it. And, at that point, the funeral director didn't know that your grandfather had more than enough means to bury himself, but the level of sincerity and kindness that he exhibited, looking me straight in the eye, was really, it's moving to this day.
Hmm.
Thanks for sharing that.
Well
I didn't
done.
know that. So in that case, there is a level of not just kavod to the bereaved family, but there's a secondary level in which that funeral director was allowing you to give kavod to your loved one, to my loved one. And I think that that is why this word kavod is actually so challenging to define and needs to have all three of these words. And we didn't even look into the word important, but needs to have all of these different layers of importance, of dignity, of honor, of respect, because that's really what we're trying to do, not just for the deceased person, but for every person in this situation,
But
every
that
different character.
the fact that
Judy,
the
and then
Yeah, I was going
sorry,
to say the fact that the text is so emphatic about kavod ha'aniyim, which strikes, I think, it might have landed in the time that this literature was first written as a paradox. What do we mean, kavod ha'aniyim? The aniyim, by definition, the poor, don't have dignity. They lack
Mm,
respect. Because kavod also, it comes from the same root that means heavy. These are not people who are seen as heavy hitters or heavyweights in society. They are the people that society lightly casts aside or easily casts aside. And the Jewish tradition, beautifully countercultural as it often is, proposes that no, the quality of kavod pertains to our shared humanity, not to our means. It's really quite a beautiful statement of Jewish values to read this long form sugya that keeps insisting on kavod ha'aniyim, the dignity and the respect and the kavod of the poor, for the poor.
I love that you said that, especially because when we look at how Rabban Gamliel behaves, the word is the opposite of heavy. It's kal, it's light, it's lenient, it's easier, and in that way, it allows us to have some ease in giving kavod to every
Right.
person,
Frivolity,
regardless
in
of.
my view, is a terrible translation of what's
Yeah,
being
yeah, it's
suggested.
not a great
Terrible
translation.
translation. It's not a good translation. He behaved in a way that made it more lenient or ease. Again, the idea was the ease for
Yes.
everyone to have a proper Jewish burial. And as Audrey pointed out in the chat, that the Hebrew Free Burial Association provides strictly, proper Jewish funerals for families who can't afford it. The notion is pervasive in Judaism that the rite of burial, both RITE and RIGHT, is one that the community of the Jewish people must take on as a sacred responsibility. So when new Jewish congregations are established, historically, the first thing a congregation does is secure itself not land for a synagogue, but land for burial, right?
Right.
It is seen as the responsibility of the Jewish community to provide burial for Jews. And obviously, this is pre-capitalistic. So all of these norms and notions from the Jewish tradition predate societies that are founded on the idea of individual merit and accomplishment and achievement and wealth. So they fly in the face, again, beautifully countercultural, of certain cultural norms today. And I do want to say that it's not a strict either or, because you can go to any Jewish funeral home and buy a fancy casket. You can buy a beautiful mahogany casket, though the trend, the norm, even today, is still towards something more modest. So, it's not the restriction, it's more that there is a pervasive notion that plain burial for the dignity of the poor is the norm. But, there's no strict halachic restriction against a casket that is somewhat more fancy and elaborate, so long as it conforms to the halachic requirements around biodegradability and what have you. Like you can't bury a Jew in a steel casket. That's for
Right.
darn sure. Though, hilarious story, I was at a funeral last spring, and it was a busy Sunday at Sharon Gardens up in Valhalla, and there were at least three funerals taking place at the same time. And Sharon Gardens is the Jewish cemetery that is part of the much larger non-Jewish Kensico cemetery. And so I got myself in the funeral procession, and there was a lot of, waiting around because there was just kind of like a traffic situation with multiple funerals happening at the same time. But I ended up following the funeral procession out to the grave. And I'm like, I don't recognize any of these people as we're arriving at the burial plot. And it was in the Kensico portion. I'm like, well, that's strange. Normally, Jewish people are buried in the Sharon Gardens section. But I walked up to the family, or what I thought was the family, and I said, I saw the funeral director, and I'm like, am I at the right place? And she says, oh, yes, you're the minister. I said, no. And then I saw that they offloaded from the hearse a purple aluminum casket with gold trim. And I said, this is definitely not my people. And as it turns out, it was a very, very robust contingent of African American mourners who were going to bury their loved one. And I said, I have found myself at the wrong funeral. Meanwhile, their minister had gone to my funeral. So sometimes
How was their hesped? Did you hear from the family?
I did not hear how the eulogy went from the family, but there were hugs and smiles exchanged before the minister and I traded places and got ourselves to the correct funeral. And the tip off was that doesn't look like a Jewish casket to me. Um, Judy Gross.
A couple of things. One, when my parents came to this country, they met here, but they were refugees from Ukraine, what they called Russia at the time. And one of the things that they did they did get involved with was a Jewish burial society, and there was some kind of a financial support there, and it was they were very modest means, and I hadn't thought about it until now. I think that it is such an amazing part of the Jewish kavod to death and burial in general. And what it makes me think of as far as, to me, Shiva is one of the most beautiful things that our tradition calls for. And other religions, people of other religious faiths are complementary to how Jews sit Shiva and how good it is for the family that is remains. But it seems as though the funeral is the time that we honor the dead person. The Shiva is the time that we honor the people who are in mourning. And I think it's also it's a very complementary kind of a religious rite.
Lovely.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So the Jewish Burial Society, or Hebrew Burial Society, sometimes called, is in Hebrew the Chevra Kadisha, literally a holy community or a holy society of people who care for a person from the moment of death, traditionally, all the way to the moment of burial, and today sometimes to cremation. And one of the pieces of this, and Dad, I saw your comment in the chat as well, is that when you start to work with a Chevra Kadisha, in almost all Chevra Kadisha, there is a suggested donation, but there is no kind of monetary fee. No obligatory fee, because every Jewish person who wants a tahara, who wants these different rituals, should be able to have them regardless of their financial standing, which is actually predicated on this text from Rabban Gamliel. Doug and Marge.
Has anybody ever requested an open casket funeral?
In my experience, Jewish, you mean? I've never had a request for an open casket funeral. I've had many requests for families to have a few moments alone with the casket opened so they can say a final goodbye before the casket is then closed again for public display at the funeral. Alissa, is that your
They did
experience?
that with your grandfather. They did that with Aki. John.
Right.
I remember there was a time when the casket was open for a final
Yeah,
goodbye.
many people want to view the body, and again, these days, funeral homes, many Jewish people, if specifically outside of Orthodox practice, do not go through the full Chevra Kadisha process. The body is buried in, grandpa's favorite suit or grandma's favorite dress instead of in the tachrichim, the traditional shrouds which cover the face. Rabbi, did you
Yeah.
have a similar experience?
I've had a similar situation. I will say, if when the in the Chaver Kadisha that I've worked with, there are a few cases in which there is someone who was suffering from cancer or another disease for a long time, and they're buried in a piece of clothing in which the family says, this is what we want this person to be buried in because this was the thing that they felt comfortable in for the last years of their life. And I think that's a very different sentiment than our Sunday's best, which is inherently more of the Yehuda Hanasi vibe of really being a part of our time and a part of our greater culture, living in the United States in the Western world at the time in which we live. However, we do often have moments in which the family would like to view the deceased before they're buried privately. And I'll just say that it's interesting because when a deceased person goes through the tahara, this is not only certainly a rite and ritual of Jewish tradition, but it's also a last moment of care. Before a person is put back into the earth, becoming one with, we can say Mother Nature, or we could also say becoming one with the Master of the universe again. This is the last touch of care and love that they receive. And to the point where if a person has, some kind of gash or blood in their hair, the Tahara team will shampoo their hair for them, will make sure that this person is cared for with affection and love and diligence that I think is only really akin to a parent, to a child caring for a parent in their old age, or a parent caring for a child that is quite young and can't do those things for themselves.
Right.
And that's the level of care that a Tahara team puts forward when they're doing these kinds of rituals.
And my understanding, though I've never actually participated, Rabbi Platcow has extensively actually not just participated, but created Chevra Kadisha, a sacred society for burial. Amy Rosberg, our beloved pastoral care coordinator at the temple, director at the temple, has also long participated in her community's Orthodox Chevra Kadisha, where women tend to the dead women and men tend to the dead who are men. But the body is never called a body. It is always addressed by name. Mr. Goldberg, we're going to turn Mr. Goldberg over and wash this side, and then the proper lines from Tehillim, from Psalms are recited. So at all times, the person is given the kavod of being a human being and not just an object for burial. I want to take...
It's interesting that you bring that up, because the final thing that we do in the Chevra Kadisha that I work most closely with, which is the Reform Community Chevra Kadisha of New York City, is a short ritual that I learned from an Orthodox Chevra Kadisha, in which at the very end, when the casket is closed, each person on the team goes around and says their Hebrew name followed by the Hebrew name of the deceased, in a way of bonding ourselves, as we would say, Tzor Bitzor Chachayim, which is a phrase that you have heard in the El Male, the morning prayer, the bonds of life. We are bonding ourselves to this person, even in their moment of death, to the bonds of life. I see Sandy, and I'm sure Rabbi Blake, you also want to continue because I know we
Yep. So
have
let's take
a final
Sandy's
text.
question, and then I'll kind of
Go
like
ahead,
put a
Sandy.
coda to our study with another text. Just unmute
You know
yourself
what?
kindly, Sandy.
We're running out of time. I think
No, we're
it's more
not.
important for you to do teaching than for me to make my comments. So
Okay.
No, we have a luxury of time, Sandy.
are we? Do we?
Sandy, what's on your mind? And let's see where it goes.
Well, first of all, I do agree with Rabbi. I think this whole thing is about uh, humanity. It's recognizing our common humanity, whether you're the respect, the whatever your level is, you're a human being, and that's what I'm seeing. And then I was thinking that I've learned so much. The only dead people I remember seeing are my husband and my parents. And I went not to a temple, but to a funeral home because that's what I knew at the time. And the coffin was open, and I'm remembering, and I think that they were dead, but they were really dead people. They were, all shot up with whatever you do, the funeral home does
Right.
to the body.
Yes.
But maybe what I'm beginning to see from this education is that it's more honorable to the humanity and the person to have a natural treatment.
Right. I mean, modern mortuary science expends tremendous effort in the cosmetic aspect of making a dead body look not like a dead body. No, I'm trying to withhold judgment because I know many of you have, laid your loved ones to rest in accordance with very strict traditional Jewish practice and others with less strict practice. And many people want to see their loved one lying in repose in the casket in a way that reminds you of how they looked when they were alive. And so all sorts of cosmetic wizardry and science is applied to make a dead body look not like a dead body. But for those of us who have seen dead bodies up close and personal, I can assure you, you will never mistake a dead body for a person who is sleeping. It's not the same thing. And it's not, I mean, yes, at first you check for a pulse and breathing and all of the signs of actual, physical demise. But very, very quickly, a dead body does not look like a living body.
And
So
if you
okay,
touch that body,
it's
you
cold.
know that it's
Correct. Yeah, and no amount of mortuary science can fix that, can change that. Okay, let's move on. We have a lovely text that kind of like constitutes a coda to our exploration today because it really touches on similar themes, but in a very different way. It's not from the Talmud, it's
got
from
my
Midrash
video.
Rabbah, which is the large collection of homiletical midrashim or uh, rabbinic excurses on biblical texts that are intended to read between the lines, which is what great midrash does. It amplifies and elaborates the text in imaginative directions that appeal to the philosophy and the sensibilities of the rabbis who are encountering the ancient text the way we encounter the ancient text, but they took incredible flights of fancy as they unpacked the innermost meanings of the text. So that is midrash as a genre, and this is midrash on the book of Kohelet. So it seems fitting, having just come through the Sukkot season, that we would take one more glance at the scroll that is customarily read and chanted and studied during the festival of Sukkot, which is Kohelet in Hebrew or Ecclesiastes. Most famously, if you say to yourself, "Huh, that sounds like a fancy book. I don't think I've ever read it." You know the familiar passage. For everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to live and a time to die, and so forth. Pete Seeger and then the Birds turned it into a popular song, Turn, Turn, Turn. And this is a midrash on one verse from that same book, different chapter. But you can see the themes of Ecclesiastes are highly recursive. It keeps saying very similar wisdom, and it is considered to be wisdom literature. And let's look at it. Okay, so the verse that this midrash will explore is from Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 14. And it says, Ka'asher yatsa mi beten imo, when a person or as a person came out of his mother's womb, Gniva Amar Lishual Shematza Kerem. So a guy named Gniva, this is just the name of a person, said, well, what is this like? Gniva Amar Lishual. It's like a fox, like a little fox, Shematza Kerem, who found a vineyard. And the vineyard, oops, sorry, I should forget that I shouldn't highlight these things. So just watch my little cursor here. V'haya mesuyag mikol pinotav, a vineyard that was fenced on all four sides, all corners. Vayasham nekev echad, and in the fencing there was a nekev, which is like an aperture, a hole, a little opening. Vikesh li kanespo, and he wanted to get inside of it. So this fox sees a way to get into the vineyard because he wants to have some grapes for lunch. Likanespo velahava yachel, but he wasn't able to. We flipped all of a sudden to Aramaic, by the way, which is what happens in these texts. It jumps back and forth between Hebrew and Aramaic. So velahava yachel, he wasn't able. Ma'avad, so what did the fox do? Tzam telat yomim, he fasted for 3 days. The fox, very, very intelligent fox. Ad dechachesh v'tashash. Okay, so just up to the point, and you can see this in the translation, that it became very thin and weak. All right, so our little fox fasts for 3 days. He becomes very thin and weak. Ve'al b'chada nekuva, at which point he was able to fit through the hole. Right, so he slimmed down to get into the vineyard. Ve'achal v'shaman, and he ate, and he became fat. So now he's inside the vineyard, he's munching on the grapes, and he's fattening up again. But once it was inside, it couldn't get out. He's in the vineyard, he's too fat to fit through the hole. And you can see, just I won't do the Aramaic here, it again fasted for 3 more days, right? Until it was thin and weak, and it returned to be as it had been, and then it exited. When it exited, it turned its face and looked back at the vineyard. So now the fox, slimmed down, is looking at this vineyard and he goes, vineyard, vineyard, what good are you? You lousy vineyard, and what good are the fruits that are in you? Everything that is in you is good and excellent. However, what benefit is there from you? Just as one enters into you, so he emerges. In other words, he got into the vineyard, he was able to eat and enjoy himself, but he couldn't take it with him. When he got to the other side, the only way he could get out was by returning to his original state, right? And so he comes out of the vineyard, and now he's derived net zero benefit from having been in the vineyard, right? All the grapes that he enjoyed stuffed his face. He had to fast to get out of the vineyard. All right. This world is the same. It's going to leave it be, and then it's going to make a second analogy to illustrate the point. Another matter. As one emerged from his mother's womb, so he will return naked to go as he came. And if you've ever heard the phrase, naked as we came, or naked as one came, it comes from the book of Ecclesiastes. It's biblical, and it's found its way into idiomatic English parlance. It is taught, as a person comes, so he will go. And I love this. Okay, she'adam ba le'olam yadav. Let's see if I can find it here. It's beautiful in the Hebrew. Okay, Tanya, kamo sheba adam ken yelech. That's the phrase we're looking at. Just as a person came into the world, so too that person leaves the world. So we leave the same way we came. Adam ba bekol. A person comes into the world shouting and screaming. V'niftar min ha'olam, and is taken from the world as a dead body, or when in death, with wailing. Like he raises his voice in death. Ba'le olam bivchia, he comes into the world crying. V'niftar min ha'olam bivchia, crying. He leaves the world. Ba'le olam bechiba, v'niftar min ha'olam bechiba. Just as he comes into the world with affection, chiba literally means an embrace. So the first thing that happens to a child is embraced by the parents. So too one leaves the world with affection. He comes into the world with a sigh and takes his leave of the world with a sigh. He comes to the world without knowledge and takes his leave of the world without knowledge. And then my favorite part of the Midrash, the concluding section, it is taught in the name of Rabbi Meir. When a person comes to the world, his fists are clenched. So a baby is gripping and grasping with the ability to do so that a baby innately has when they emerge from the womb. As though to say the entire world is mine, I will inherit. I'm going to take it all. That's how a baby, so they're just observing like the tendency of babies to be able to grip is a baby's way of communicating even without words. I want it all. I'm going to grab it all. I'm going to take it all from this world. But when you take your leave of this world, one's hands are open as though to say, I did not inherit anything in the world. And then King Solomon adds, as one emerged from his mother's womb, so he will return naked to go as he came, and he will take nothing for his toil that he can carry in his hand. And by the way, that's just a gloss for his toil that he can carry in his hand, because Steinsaltz wants us to know, or whoever's translating this, which is actually not Steinsaltz, wants us to know that, well, we don't take with us anything that we can hold in our hands. The question becomes, well, what do we take with us when we die? Barbara Verhab pointed out in our chat window much earlier in today's class that the tachrichim, the shrouds that were buried in traditional Orthodox practice, do not have pockets, and that is intentional. It's a garment without pockets that quite directly suggests you can't take it with you. So I love this text as a kind of, complement with an E, complement to the passage that Rabbi Platcow elucidated for us this morning, because we're not only thinking about the difference between the rich and the poor and their families and loved ones and the mourners left behind and how we provide for dignity for the poor. We also want to acknowledge that in life, the difference between rich and poor is perhaps material, but when it comes to ultimate worth versus net worth, it is immaterial. All of the things that we spent our lives accumulating are not things we can take with us. We're like that little fox that expended all of that effort to get into the vineyard, ate its fill, and then realized the only way to get out is to release it all. You have to get rid of everything. You can't even take your knowledge with you. Like everything you have spent your life accumulating, at the end of the day, you're going to leave this world with nothing. And yet, that's not actually a cause for despair. The book of Ecclesiastes wants to suggest that's the way of the world. And the rabbis would later elaborate, and some of you who've learned Pirkei Avot with me in previous iterations of our online study will recall a passage that talks about the different crowns that a person can attain in one's lifetime. There's the crown of priesthood, of public service, that is. There's the crown of royalty or of leadership. There's the crown of wealth, but there is above all, the Mishnah suggests, the crown of a good name, which is the one thing that surpasses all other earthly gifts. Barbara, your comment here, please.
Exactly what I want. I'm battling a cold, so excuse me.
Me too. Me too.
That's exactly what I wanted to say. You go out of this world with the crown of a good name.
Ideally.
Rabbi, where does that phrase come from? A crown
It comes
of a good
from
name.
Pirkei Avot. I can get you chapter and verse, or perhaps Rabbi Platcow can look that one up, the crown of a good name. I was thinking a lot about Pirkei Avot because there is much wisdom in Avot that is commensurate with or complementary to what we've learned today. So here's another one, just as a coda to the coda. Akavia ben Mahalalel. All right, so another sage. And again, the beauty of Safari is you just click on the sage's name and you get a capsule bio. So a first generation Tana from the approximately active during the years 20 to 40 of the Common Era, and an independent and highly principled scholar who was offered the position of head of court on condition that he would rescind his rulings. He refused, and it appears that he was excommunicated. So interesting that we have preserved here a teaching by the lesser-known sage Akavia ben Mahalalel, Omer. He says, Histakel bishlosha devarim. Look closely. Histakel means to look in a way that's penetrating. Bishlosha devarim, at three things, v'i ata ba lidei avera, and you will never fall into the hands of transgression. So if you look closely at these three things, or if you consider well the following three things, you won't slip up in life. Da me ayin bata, know from whence you came. Ule'an ata holech, know where you are going. That's number two. V'lifnei mi ata atid litain din v'cheshbon. And this is going to tie us to what we're going to learn next week, by the way. Know before whom in the future you must give judgment and accounting. So we're going to talk next week about how are we judged when we die? And what are the questions that we are asked after we die? So that's all next week. This is a good way to end today's study because it's a teaser trailer for next week. Me'ayin bata. So where did you come from? Well, this is not a very heartening sentiment, but Akavia ben Mahalalel wants you to believe mitipa surucha, from a putrid little drop probably of ejaculate. Really, that's probably what is meant here. That you just come from this goo. From yucky goo, you came. Ule'an ata holech. Where are you going? Limekom afar rima v'tolea. You are going to a place filled with dust and worms and maggots. And I'm really sorry, Audrey, if you're still with us. I saw your comment in the chat box earlier that you're afraid of insects. That does not bode well for your hereafter. All I can say is that the main thrust is that we also are not conscious beings at the time of our death and after, right? So does it really matter? If a tree falls in a forest, in this case, if your body is eaten up by worms and maggots, but you're not around to notice it, does it really matter? Well, that is not the question that is being asked. It merely wants to say you come from a place of yucky goo. You're going to a place of, decomposing matter, to put it a little bit more charmingly. V'lifnei mi ata atid liten din v'cheshbon, and before whom must you give accounting and judgment? Lifnei melech malchei hamalachim. That's a phrase we all know from Aleinu, the end of our prayer service. Before the Holy One, the sovereign of all sovereigns, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One of blessing. So God is brought in, and again, this is just a setup for where we're going to pick up next time. Mom and Dad, I'm going to give you the final question for today, and then we'll wrap things for this morning.
Not really a question, John, but more in the way of a public service announcement. Maybe doesn't have much to do with this, but I think the group should know that there's going to be a No Kings rally Saturday between 4 and 5:30 at Harbor Island Park in Mamaroneck. Cool.
Thank you for the PSA. I will be on a bima, but I'm glad that you shared. It sounds like you and Mom are coming into town. I may or may not be able to squeeze in a hug, but I'm down for the count with a cold, which is why I'm working.
We don't want to hug you in that case. Take our love by remote control.
Love you guys. Love being with all of our learners today. Love the opportunity to tag team learn and teach with my colleague, Rabbi Alissa Platcow from WRT. If you're learning with her for the first time, I think you're understanding a lot more about her service to the Jewish community as a passionate and very, very learned teacher of Judaism. So it's a pleasure, Alissa, to learn with you and from you, of course, and from all of you. Take this learning and use it to contemplate more deeply what this earthly journey is about, especially if all we're going to is a place of decomposing matter. The rabbis would like us to spend a little bit of time thinking more about how we spend our days, and that will be elaborated in next week's class. So we'll see you a week from now. And join us for Shabbat. Tomorrow's service is at 5:30 p.m. Family-friendly Shabbat, but we will also begin to acknowledge the return of our living hostages. And a few more remains of hostages did come home yesterday, and we don't know if they will ever, all bodies will be reunited with their loved ones. But we are going to have a little ritual during the outset of tomorrow's service to acknowledge that this week was a turning point for this terrible chapter in Jewish history. And may it be an end to the brutality and suffering that has been incurred since October 7th. Thanks.
Yasher Koach.
Praise God.
Kol hakavod, Rabbi.
Toda rabba.
Yasher
Yasher
Koach
Koach.
Lachem.
Phil, Marge, Doug, nice to see you again.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks,
Good to
everyone.
see you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank God.
Thanks, Judy.
Stay well. Have
You
a
too.
good Shabbos.
Bye.